Series today. My name is Nic Dunn, and I serve as Vice President of Strategy and Communications for Sutherland Institute. And our panelists today, I'll start here on the end with Beth Akers. Beth is a Senior Fellow for the American Enterprise Institute. She is also a feature contributor to Sutherland Institute's podcast, Defending Ideas, where she talks about defending enterprise. Also, we are joined by Peter Phillips. He is a professor of economics here at the University of Utah and also a former chair of the economics department here at the university. Beth and Peter, thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Is this working?
It is.
Am I working?
Well, we'll see over the next 45 minutes, right?
We have both committed to be as charming as Senator Romney, though it seems not as many folks will be here to take pleasure in that. But.
That's okay. We'll send the video far and wide. And
Next time I want to follow Ted Cruz, I think it might be an easier lift.
Well, I think that was a great discussion to kind of tee things up with both of you, because we want to give the folks in our audience and the folks watching online kind of some understanding of economic policy. How are things looking today? Any prognostication for the future? And I want to start out by making a pop culture reference, which maybe doesn't happen as often for folks in the world of economics. But recently there was a country song by a man named Oliver Anthony called Rich Men North of Richmond. Essentially, it's kind of a working class lament about it's hard to get ahead in this economy. You work hard and you don't get paid enough, and things are just tough economically. It has started a national conversation around that question of the health of our economy across the nation and whether we truly are an upwardly mobile society. So in the context of these debates that have been going on as far as the economic health of the United States, I want to ask both of you for the opening question. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate the economic health of the United States and of Utah? 1 being it's the worst economy we've ever had. There's no such thing as upward mobility. Everyone is just stuck. Your hard work doesn't matter. And then 10 being it's the greatest economy in any of our lifetimes or in history. You know, anyone who is not rising up swiftly, they only can blame themselves. So somewhere on that 1 to 10 spectrum, Peter, let's start with you and then go to Beth. National economy, Utah economy, 1 to 10. What's your take?
In the summertime, I'm a backcountry ranger in the Grand Teton National Park. And this summer, I went into the Target that had just been built in Jackson. And I was talking to the cashiers as I bought my product. And she said she lived in Idaho Falls, and she commuted to work at Target every day, about an hour and a half each way. And the reason was she could make $15 an hour in Idaho Falls at the Target there and make $25 an hour in Jackson at the Target. The reason she could make more in Jackson is because people making $15 or even $25 an hour can't live in Jackson. They have to live over the hill. And as prices rise in the communities on the other side of the mountain, they have to live farther and farther away. And so Idaho Falls is a place where she had to live to find a job to make $25 an hour. If she worked full-time for a year, that would translate into $50,000 a year. And if you subtracted just the wear and tear on her car and the cost of transportation, that $50,000 goes down. And if you take the 3 hours a day that she travels, that $50,000 goes down more. And she's not at the bottom of the heap at all. But the people that live in Jackson are at the top of the heap. The entry-level home in Jackson costs $2.5 million a year. I never knew rich people before I became a backcountry ranger in the Grand Tetons. Now I know a gruntload of people that do things like, well, the one I'm thinking about, he owns an airplane, and his wife owns an airplane. And he is selling his house to downsize because it was a 60,000 square foot house with a 20,000 square foot cabin in the back. And so he's selling that for $27 million, and he's going to go down into something smaller. I even heard him use the word condo. And that is, in terms of personal reality, where we are. I live near Liberty Park, and I just bought a smartwatch, which is a dictator. and insists that I walk 10,000 steps a day. And so I go around Liberty Park. And every morning, because you get up earlier, you're going to sweat yourself to death. Every morning, as I walk around Liberty Park, I see the homeless folks that spent the night there being cleared out for the day to make room for me so I can obey my smartwatch. Okay. On a scale of 1 to 10, I give our economy a 5. A 5 getting credit for we're kind of making it, and a 5 for subtracting credit for we're not sort of making it together, we're making it apart. And I would like to see more making it that had some more togetherness of it. And that's really what I take from Senator Romney when he talks about social capital. I didn't hear Senator Romney when he went into social capital. I heard Mission President Romney. And for me, that's a plus. I'm not a member of the church, but I fully join the Hosanna chorus that Utah benefits from the Mormon church and the social capital it provides by keeping people together as opposed to people keeping apart. So 1 to 10, I pick a 5 because that measures we're getting it, but we're getting it apart instead of together.
Thank you, Peter. Beth.
Great. Yeah. So, great points. I'll do a bit more of, I think, an economic snapshot of where we are today. So, if you're a viewer of cable news, we are always in deep crisis and everyone's hair is always on fire. The reality about our economic situation today is, in fact, for people who are looking for work, they're in pretty good situation. There's plenty of stories of individuals commuting for jobs and things like that that are, not earning them a living wage and things. But on average, people who are looking for work are finding it. We have a historically low rate of unemployment, 3.5%. Reflecting a tremendous recovery from the COVID pandemic and what could have been a really catastrophic economic situation. So we're in good circumstances there. We're continuing to see that prices are rising in the economy, which has negative effects on families and individuals who are trying to pay the bills, but we're seeing that is slowing, and so it's trending in the right direction. So generally speaking, the snapshot of America's economy today is good for American workers. I'm going to give us a 6, and then I'm going to give Utah an 8, even better. So the thing I didn't talk about yet was opportunity in America, which is, of course, I think really central to thinking about the health of our economy. Research shows, in fact, that there is opportunity for people to raise themselves out of the circumstances in which they're born into. And in fact, referencing what Senator Romney raised earlier, some of the research was that we know that Utah actually excels in this dimension, and that the opportunity that people have to raise their financial circumstances from where they're born to where they land as an adult is actually tremendous. And Utah stands out first in that category, and social capital being one of the potential drivers that allows that to be the case. So I'm going to give a 6 to us at a national level and an 8 to us locally here in Utah.
And I want to take off on what Beth just said. The last 3 years were incredible in terms of the American economy and our experience of it. In 2020 and 2021, we almost got hit by a bus collectively. Unemployment rose to a height only approximated the Great Depression, 20% unemployment. 15% unemployment, 50% higher than the highest unemployment of the Great Recession or the Big Recession of 1980-81. But that unemployment went away in a blink of the eye. And not only did it go away, it went way far away. So the Beth is spot on that today we have an unemployment level that matches the best years of the 1950s. So that's an amazing outcome. The bus missed us, and we're not roadkill. But
or we were roadkill, and then we rose back up. Something like that, I think.
Right after that huge spike in unemployment, there became a huge spike in inflation. So inflation spiked to double what it was at any point in time since World War II. But then it appears to be going away in almost the same blink of an eye. And economists like to arm wrestle over details, and so we're only sort of 2/3 of the way gone, and it may stay here, and that's bad news, or it may disappear just like the unemployment did, which was good news. So it's an open question as to whether or not that huge disruption in the American economy is not going to have a lasting echo. But at the moment, it looks like maybe it's not.
You both touched on a couple things, and I want to see if we can intertwine together. And I'm glad you mentioned inflation. I want to get to that a little bit later, especially when we talk about the context of family affordability for young people who are forming families right now or looking to form families, starting their careers, how sort of the feeling of the burden of increasing costs might affect them. So I want to get more into that, but to kind of lay the groundwork for that, when we talk about the strength of an economy, and I think it kind of came through in both of your answers, that embedded in that definition is upward mobility and opportunity. And so if an economy is doing great for a lot of people, but it feels like some folks are getting left behind, we all want to focus on that. We all care about that. So from the standpoint of upward mobility, and Beth, you mentioned Utah being an 8. I wonder if you both can talk a little bit more about what are the factors, and for folks here who say, well, I want to support economic policy that's going to mean upward mobility for as many people as possible. It's going to mean as many families as possible can afford to provide for their families. Thinking in those terms, how should we be understanding and defining what it means to have a strong economy, and how much does sort of the upward mobility of the folks on the lower rungs of the economic ladder factor into that definition? And what are some of the factors? If you had to pick just 2 or 3, these are the most important things that we wish all of our policymakers and our business leaders would really focus on when it came to creating an economy that was genuinely an upwardly mobile society. What are those core factors that define a strong economy with lots of opportunity? Beth, let's start with you.
Sure. So I'd have to say that I think the framework I want to imagine is that we're creating opportunity. We're not creating the mobility. We're not forcing individuals, into different segments of the economy. What we're doing is creating mechanisms that allow for people to create a life and well-being for themselves. I think education is sort of the most obvious manner in doing that. We've seen historically primary and post-secondary education serving as a tremendous vehicle for social mobility. So I think we need to continue to maintain our investments in those, also maintain competitiveness in those sectors in order to sustain their excellence. But again, I think our emphasis should be on maintaining opportunity at the lower levels of the income distribution. The emphasis should be on ensuring that we don't have a system of economy where the economic circumstances that you're born into are the sentence that you have for the rest of your life. Research has shown in a number of different places that in fact we have a pretty high level of social mobility in this country. Could we do better? Certainly. Could we invest more in other mechanisms that do a better job of providing alternative pathways to mobility through career training, apprenticeship programs, things like that? Absolutely. But I think that's where the emphasis should be.
Peter, how do you define that? How do you define an upwardly mobile economy, and what are the factors that we should focus on to create that?
When I was in high school, I told my dad that I was going to be a really good student, and I was going to go to Pomona College, which was one of the most exclusive liberal arts colleges around, and then I was going to go to either Stanford or Berkeley, and then I was going to go out there and be a great economist. And my father turned to me in very stern voice. He said, "Son, it's better to be lucky than to be good." And it turned out the smartest thing I did was to be born in 1947. It was a good choice on my part, because that meant that when I graduated and went out the labor market, there were lots of jobs. I got 23 job interviews and 7 job offers when I came out with my PhD. Had I come out just a little bit later, because I came out in 1978, if I come out in 1980 or 1981, I would have been screwed, because I forgot what my dad told me. Be lucky, son. Be sure to be lucky. How Senator Romney said, you know, recessions come and go. Don't worry about them. They're around for a year or two, and then they're gone. Well, I think that was reflecting his experience as a young man, which was my experience as a young man, because the downturns in the 1950s were common, but they were short-lived. They became a little fewer and farther between starting in the 1960s. Through the 1970s and 1980s, they became a little more spread apart. Starting about 1990, they got further apart. They began to be about 8 years apart or something like that. But the mother of all great downturns in 2007-8 lasted for 6 years before we got back to go. And what happened to the folks that came out into the labor market in the period 2008 through 2015 is they just didn't have the same start that other people had. Rodney Dangerfield said, I went to the track, and when the gun went off, they shot my horse. And if you are going into the labor market and you're going in during a big downturn like that, they're shooting you. And so one really good policy that the government can have to help with upward mobility is to help more people be lucky by having fewer time periods where the labor market is totally dead. And that's one of the great things that has happened recently, and it's just astounded me, and I think much of the economics profession, is that federal policy took what could easily have been the second Great Recession within a decade and blew it away. So the recession got shot instead of us.
So let's dive into that for a second to kind of bring it to the present day. And you're specifically talking about the impact of the pandemic and how essentially virtually overnight putting a stop to huge sections of the economy in terms of economic activity with people staying home or not going to work, or in some cases working remotely, but so many things kind of ground to a halt. Your contention is essentially, look, because of the federal response, we averted what could have otherwise been even a deeper and a much more prolonged recession. So I want to see if we can talk about some of the pros and cons with that, because if you're saying, look, that helped to soften what otherwise would have been really, really rough for the country. You mentioned earlier as well the issue of inflation and how costs of regular consumers, folks are feeling it in their grocery bill, in their gas bill, in their housing costs, of course. So I wonder if between the two of you, let's talk through, just from your best angle objectively, what are some of the pros and cons from the federal response to what could have been a really severe post-pandemic recession? And then maybe give a sense of, well, where are we now? What should we do moving forward with respect to that specific recovery?
I think Professor Phillips and I agree that, this was actually a resounding success and that we avoided what could have been catastrophic. I think where there is a difference, whether the difference is between he and I or not, I'm not sure, is about whether or not the effort and the fiscal spending that occurred to prevent that overshot the mark and could have been restrained in a way that would have allowed us to avoid some of the pain that we are now experiencing in the form of the high interest rates and inflation. And so, there's criticism all the time of the specific spending that took place. For instance, the Paycheck Protection Program allowed a lot of businesses to stay in operation, which was part of the mechanism for supporting the economy to come back online quickly so that we didn't experience that second Great Recession. But then we see critiques all the time about how a lot of that money went to rich businesses or rich individuals who are business owners. And so there's a tension there, is that did we go too far in spending resources that pushed us into the place we are today, which is with rampant inflation, which seems to be getting into control. And I do tend to think that we're on the path towards the soft landing that we were all hoping for, but seemed like a pie in the sky dream maybe a year ago. So I think that's where the tension is, if there's any, in our retrospective analysis of what happened.
Peter, overall a good response, but did we go too far?
If you've ever watched a prize fight and you see some fighter that's on the rope and the other fighter is about to deliver a knockout punch, and the one on the rope ducks to avoid that knockout punch but gets caught with a left hook, and you say, are you sorry you missed that knockout punch because you got a left hook? And the fighter says, under the circumstances, I'll take the left hook. And in this case, the inflation that we've experienced is that left hook. And I don't know where you got this, gal, because I'm supposed to disagree with the Sutherland folks. But I don't think, if we dug down into the details, we could probably disagree. I'm going to probably talk about...
I'm confident of that, yeah. Just may not get
I
there
could
today.
probably talk about supply chains a little bit more and sort of the structural as opposed to a monetary explanation of some of that inflation. But we're not going to disagree. A, the inflation was there, and boy, was it there. And B, the inflation's coming down. Boy, is it coming down. And C, it's not down. And at the moment, it's at 6%, which is pretty close to unacceptable. And so those are the facts. And one nice thing about economists is that they can agree on many of the facts, but it's not nearly as fun in terms of calling names. But I take it. The economy is on the ropes. They missed the knockout punch. They got the left hook. And now we're going to see whether they can bounce back into the middle of the ring and get through the rest of the round.
And I think part of what's still in debate, even though we agree on that sort of fact, is really what are the consequences of maintaining fiscal deficits, for example. It seems like before we got to COVID and the fiscal intervention that prevented that and maybe led us to where we are today, there was a disagreement between maybe not economists, but between political types about what are the consequences of maintaining deficits and spending beyond our means. And I think, my perspective of what happened with the COVID and the inflation that we saw as a result of the massive fiscal intervention is that put a bit of a check on the theory that we could continue to spend without restraint, but would not face any consequences. And maybe you feel differently about that one.
Now we're into the mud wrestling.
I'm just trying to make it exciting.
I'm not sure we want to go down that road. I just will quickly highlight for the listeners that Beth's perspective sees the federal budget like a family budget. And in my view, there's a fundamental error in that analogy. And the error is the family does not print its own money. And the federal government does. Now, Beth is likely to say, well, that's a bad thing, but then would have to get into the conversation about whether that's a bad thing or a good thing. But the family budget model for the federal budget is an imperfect analogy.
So with that, though, let's mud wrestle for a little bit, just to give something interesting to the folks out there. But so how should we be thinking about government spending at the federal level? So when large proposals come forth, there are often voices saying, well, some of this I might support, but it's way too expensive. We need to cut back the spending. Some of Senator Romney's proposals in his time in the U.S. Senate have included mechanisms to make it essentially cost neutral, saying, well, I want to propose this. A good example is the Family Security Act, where he was looking at other ways that they could trim some spending or consolidate funding streams elsewhere to strive towards things like that being budget neutral. So maybe I'll phrase it in that way, that when we are thinking about big or impactful policy ideas at the federal level going through Congress, is it a good thing to strive for those to be budget neutral, or does that not actually matter that much in the long run? Peter, I'll go with you first, then Beth to the rebuttal.
I want you to stand right down there, and I want you to lift one foot off the ground. And then pick the other foot off the ground. Are you a foot off the ground?
I think that probably wouldn't work.
No, that's not going to work for you. Okay. And if you use the family budget or a business budget as a model for the federal budget, you're going to miss a key point. In contrast to you as an individual or one of the businesses that Senator Romney bought and ran, the federal government can literally pick one foot off the ground and the other foot off the ground and be a foot off the ground under several circumstances, not all circumstances, but several circumstances. There is a circumstance in when that's not possible, and that's where that all of the productive resources are otherwise engaged. So that if the federal government picks one foot off the ground and then picks the other foot off the ground, the federal government has to pull away from one of these other uses, whether state uses or private uses, putting that one of those 2 feet back on the ground. But as long as there are unused resources, you can pull off a magic trick and be a foot off the ground. You can't do it, a business can't do it, but the federal government can do it under certain circumstances. And during the pandemic recession, during the Great Recession, during the Great Depression, those were circumstances where the government could pull off this magic levitation, because you pull the 1 foot off the ground, you pick the other foot up, and you're pulling not resources that Beth is using, but you're pulling resources that were not being used into being used. And so that's why using the budget analogy to understand the federal budget has strong exceptions.
Beth, magical levitation, is that wise economic fiscal policy?
my
I just like the
Did I
analogy.
say
so.
that? Yes, I
My
did.
PhD is not in magic; it's instead in economics. So I'll offer a counter view. My sense is I don't think that's wrong. I mean, I think there are instances at an individual or a family and at a federal level where it is appropriate to spend beyond your means. For instance, I encourage people to borrow to pay for college. It's a great investment. There are times when borrowing, issuing debt can yield great things for the country. In this instance of spending for evading the COVID recession, I mean, the returns on that spending, at least the first 50, 75% of it, were probably quite huge. My concern is that when we've gone beyond to the point where we are today, that there are in fact consequences, and the trade-offs that we're signing up for may not in fact be worth what we're getting for it. When I say consequences, I do believe that some of the inflation that we've experienced are because of our fiscal policy that we have employed. We've also seen that U.S. debt has been downgraded. The interest on outstanding U.S. debt is now a massive portion of our federal budget. Eventually, at this pace, will become the largest line item in the federal budget. And so I think that, I don't think that's wrong, but I do think that we're farther into that situation to the point where the trade-offs are not necessarily in our favor. And I think we should be concerned more than we are today about maintaining budget neutrality on new proposals.
There she goes again, using the family budget as an analogy for the federal government. If you're going to use the family budget borrowing as an analogy for the federal government, you have to mention my daughter. Because when she borrows from me, she knows one key fact. She's never going to have to pay it back. The federal government, when it borrows, do you know who it borrows from? The federal government. It makes the money and then spends the money. And okay, let's see. Let's say that the federal budget, the federal debt is 10 times the federal budget. What could we do? Borrow some more. And that really wouldn't work if you're a family or a business. And it's not going to really happen in terms of the federal government, but I use that extreme example to drive home the point. Don't use the analogy of personal or business budgets to think about the federal budget, because there's one big difference. The federal borrows in U.S. dollars that the federal government makes itself.
Beth, we're almost at time, but any quick reply to that? I could see this turning into a great, maybe come on our podcast, we'll do a future event, but this is a good discussion.
This is a debate over Keynesianism, folks.
Yes, this is a debate that goes much deeper than the two of us and has been raging in our profession for longer than I have been a part of it. So I don't think we'll succeed in resolving it today. But I do think, again, I'll emphasize, the creation of dollars has consequences in terms of inflation, which I believe, are potentially more consequential than the things we're giving up in terms of the spending. And so that is going to be a personal value judgment that we probably won't be able to agree on today.
Never bet against a team that has barrels of green ink.
So we'll have to leave that issue, though it's a very fascinating one. As we start to wrap up, and we'll have some time for questions, so any of you folks here, questions from our two panelists, we'll have a few minutes for that. So be thinking of what you want to ask, and I think we'll have a microphone. Nick back there has a mic he can pass around to get those questions from you so the folks on the live stream can hear it. Maybe to kind of to to kick off our audience Q&A portion, I want to read a statistic from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, kind of bringing things back a little bit to the really practical, the state of the workforce today, the ability of somebody who is looking for a work opportunity to be able to find that and use that as an engine of upward mobility to provide for themselves or their family. So the U.S. Chamber found that there are currently 9.8 million job openings in the U.S., but only 5.9 million unemployed workers. I want to get your quick reactions to that. What does that statistic tell you about the state of the workforce today? Is there just a mismatch? Are people just not willing to work? What is it that's creating such a big gap, and what should folks in the room and online understand about that number? Beth, let's go with you first, and then Peter.
On a slightly wonky note, I'll say I'm a little bit concerned about the way that we measure job openings today, and it may look like there are a lot more. But, the other data that we have all indicates that we have a really tight labor market. And I think that means for the vast majority of people who have, the physical resources to go and work, that means that opportunity exists. I think that our focus should not be on the question of whether that opportunity exists, but rather for people who have constraints on their ability to participate in the labor market, how do we support them? And so first acknowledging that opportunity exists, that it's actually quite robust in our economy, it is an important thing, and then turn to what else?
Peter, is there a serious labor force shortage that's affecting our economy that we should be concerned about?
Beth doesn't fight fair. She uses correct statistics. I was hoping that these Chamber of Commerce statistics would be out on the table to be chopped up, but she took them right off. There's a federal survey called Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey, which is, if you're interested in sort of the tightness or looseness of the labor market and the availability of jobs, that's the go-to statistics to look at. Although just simply talking about an unemployment rate of 3% is going to tell you that the labor market is tight. Now, the 1,000-pound gorilla in the room was something mentioned by Senator Romney, and that is the declining labor force participation rate, particularly of men in their prime age, which is considered to be age 25 to 55. Historically, the labor force participation of men rose in the 1800s. Around World War I, it was up around 90%. During World War II, it was through the roof. But it had been steadily in the low to middle 90s until the 2000s. And since then, it has been going down. It's in the high 80s at the moment. There is work being done on that, some very good work. There's a literature called The Deaths of Despair, where particularly rural males are dying unexplainably through overdoses and suicides when they should be doing what Senator Romney said, really Mission President Romney said, which is you should have a passion and you should be following that passion, be committed to it, and if you're engaged, you're going to be living well. And we have statistics that suggest that for some people that is just not happening. And that is very discouraging and concerning, and we don't know enough about the answers. But I can tell you that I have a sense of one of the bottom part of that distribution. I walk around Liberty Park, as I mentioned, and I see lots of homeless folks that Liberty Park is their living room. And these homeless folks are in that prime age. They are not teenagers. Well, they're not geezers the way I define geezers as somebody older than me. And they're failing themselves, and I like to think we're failing them. I know I have a sense of dismay and even guilt walking around the park and seeing that. And we need to turn our attention to that for every reason that Senator Romney, Mission President Romney, said.
So there are people in need out there. They are deserving of opportunities, and I like kind of ending this portion on that compassionate note, that we want our economy to be a place that creates and fosters opportunity for those folks. We have a few minutes for questions, so who in the audience has something on their mind? Let's start right here, and we'll have time for a few of you. So Please go ahead.
Just kind of thought, yeah, it is.
I don't think it's turned on. Oh, okay. Sing into it, just like karaoke.
Piggybacking off of the discussions regarding industry deregulation and just regulation regarding things like AI, what do you think creates this aversion towards things like fiscal policy when it comes down to policies like broader student debt forgiveness, stimulus checks, things like that? Yet there's very little, if any, debate on things like monetary policy on the end of the Federal Reserve.
Anyone want to jump into that first? I heard college loans. You have a lot of expertise there, Beth.
Sure. So monetary policy is directed by the Federal Reserve Bank, which is politically independent from the administration and is separate from the democratic process. And so we believe that's how it should be, because as economists, we're sort of above the fray of politics, and we want the institution to operate in response to what is the mission of the institution of the Fed, which is to stabilize the economy and minimize unemployment. And whereas the other piece of it is driven by the political machine, which of course we know operates with lots of different incentives and through the political process. So I think that we see that politicians in their response to spending is trying to respond to the preferences of their constituents who are concerned about their tax rate, for example, and also at the same time concerned about their student loan balances. And so I think that they kind of just exist in two separate realms. Did you want to describe it differently than that?
I've never been above the fray. Possibly below the fray. My good father said the best strategy in life is to duck. So luck and duck were his two advices. Now, take my economic history course, and I'll explain to you that the Federal Reserve is a political entity run by the banks. And it was designed to be run by the banks. And that was its North Star, keeping the banks healthy and operating. And there's some good reasons that I'd like my bank to stay healthy and operating, thank you very much, at least until I get my money out of it, and that's everybody's thought. So we have a dog in the hunt to have the banks being healthy and operating. But after World War II, the federal government passed a law that said that the Federal Reserve has to not only think about banks operating, but think about the labor market operating. So it should have two North Stars, one that way north, which is to keep the banks healthy, and one that way north, which would make jobs plentiful. And these two North Stars were in two different norths. And the Federal Reserve has to navigate that. And because the vast majority of decision makers on the Federal Reserve are bankers, they drive like my wife does, kind of leaning a little this way and not quite down the middle of the road. And so that particular segment of government is going to be nervous about loan forgiveness because they're in the business of making loans work. And so you're not preaching to the choir when you tell the Federal Reserve that loans ought to be forgiven. And I take it you're not preaching to Beth either.
There's another hand over here.
Sorry, so I came in late, so this may be a little off topic, but I wanted to ask, what are some of the challenges of bringing jobs back to America? And what effect would it have on the American market, detriments and benefits?
I didn't fully understand the question. Could you ask it again, please?
Yes, so what are some of the challenges of bringing jobs back to America, and what effect would it have on the American market, the detriments and benefits?
Got it now, yeah. Beth, you want to try that one first?
Sure. I think that part of the reason that jobs have left America is because things can happen outside of this country cheaper. Labor is cheaper outside of the United States. May also be cheaper in certain instances because of the regulatory environment. And so from my perspective, we need a compelling reason to try to bring something back. And national security is, of course, an often cited reason for doing that. There is some, efficiency loss from bringing something back into this country that can be done cheaper elsewhere. And in every instance, policymakers should be thinking about what is the trade-off between that potential efficiency loss, that is, it costs more to do things here, versus the other goal that we're trying to achieve, be it national security or anything else. And so I think in each instance, we have to think about the potential advantages of, pursuing these separate goals versus the economic cost that is shrinking the pie by doing things, by conducting business in a way that's less than optimal.
I'm going to rewrite your question. You shouldn't have said, how can we get jobs back to America? You should have said, how can we get good jobs back to America? Jobs are back. Unemployment rate of 3%, jobs are back. But as I told in my story of the folks that are commuting from Idaho Falls to Jackson to get that job, there are a lot of good jobs that go missing. And why is that true? I'm not as worried about China from a political and military standpoint as Senator Romney is. But I'm quite worried about what a labor economist friend of mine said about 15 years ago when we were talking about China. He said, what part of 1 billion new workers in the world labor market don't you understand? And globalization has connected the American labor market to a global labor market in a way that has held down wages. Real blue-collar wages peaked in 1970 and have been basically flat since once you adjust for inflation. And that corresponds to a time period when imports as a percent of GDP rose from about 5% to about 20% of GDP. That rise being a steady rise from around 1970 to before the Great Recession. And let me give you a feeling for that. When I was in high school in 1965, somebody told me a joke, said, hey, I have a car that has 4 forward gears. And if you were in high school in 1965, 4 forward gears was bizarre. Everyone had 3 gears and they were shifted on the handle. And he was talking about 4 gears on the floor. He said, yeah, it had 4 gears, first, second, third, and bonsai. Now, that's not funny today, but that was funny because it was so strange in 1965, and he was talking about a Datsun and the beginning of importing Volkswagens, Renaults, and Datsuns to the United States. And that was the beginning of the end of Geneva Steel, of Kennecott Copper, of U.S. Steel, that's now called USX, and manufacturing employment was 1/3 of all employment in the 1950s, and it's 1/10 today. It was a total transformation of the American labor market. One of the parts of that was a significant downward part of the American labor market ended up having lousy jobs. So I want your question to say, how can we get rid of those lousy jobs and get good jobs back instead? Now, I'm going to let you think about the answer.
Well, we're a little bit over time, but was there any final, if someone has a burning question, they're like, I can't get out of here without asking, if it's very brief? If not, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, just for the recording.
Like I said, this is a topic I'm still researching myself, but you both ranked Utah. I believe you ranked Utah economy at 5 at the beginning of this meeting, and you said, I think you said 6?
I give it an 8.
8, wow. So how would you put the housing market in Utah into that? What would be your opinions on that? Because I know there's a lot of debate surrounding that.
Great question. I think we could have another forum to talk entirely about what's happening with home prices in the entire Mountain West region in particular. So I think that in the relatively recent history, we have seen this dramatic increase in prices that is making it more difficult to have a family, and potentially will have impacts on social mobility in the years to come as we look back on it. I think fortunately there are areas still in the metro area that offer affordable housing options, which is unique to this place. When you look at other cities that have really unaffordable housing, there tends to be unaffordable housing in the commuting regions as well. So I think that offers some advantages to this region, but it is a question about where that trajectory will go and the potential impacts that that will have on the nature of growth in this region.
You want a cheap housing market? Get a lousy economy. I have a former graduate student that has retired last year from a college in upstate New York. She sold her house for $125,000, moved back to Salt Lake where she grew up, bought herself a small condo for $400,000.
We want to thank everyone for the questions and for, of course, Hinckley Institute for helping us put this on. As we finish, I want to ask a 10-second response question for each of you. And it is trying to kind of give our audience a sense of, okay, what's next when it comes to economic policy. You find yourself in an elevator with the Utah governor and legislative leadership, and then the president and congressional leadership. These two groups ask you, what's the one thing we should do from a public policy perspective to strengthen our economy and create more upward mobility for Americans and for Utahns? You have 10 seconds before they get off the elevator. What do you say to them? Peter, let's go with you first, and then Beth will give you the last word.
Go talk to Beth. You're not going to listen to me.
That's right, I win. Okay. Given that, I think we need to invest in ensuring that safety nets for our lowest income residents are robust and easily accessible. Also, maintenance of our investment in the education system to ensure that people have the skills to participate in our labor market.
Well, Peter.
She got more than 10 seconds.
I think she took some of your seconds on that last part. Let's have a round of applause for our panelists. Beth Akers, Peter Phillips, thank you both for joining us, and thank you to everyone here at the University of Utah and Hinckley Institute and those watching online for this Sutherland Institute Congressional Series. Last thing we want to mention to you, there on the screen is a QR code. We'd like to encourage all of you to take the survey. Let us know how this event was. Did you find it interesting? What other things would you like to share about your experience today? That'll help us continuously improve events as we go. So thank you very much.